On the evening of October 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy walked into the Oval Office at 7 p.m. sharp. The red light blinked on.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
For the first time, the American public learned that nuclear missiles capable of striking Washington, New York, or Miami in minutes sat just 90 miles from Florida's coast. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis. It began on January 1, 1959, when Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba. Within months, U.S. businesses, oil refineries, sugar mills, casinos were nationalized. The island turned communist. Just 90 miles from the United States, a new Soviet ally was born. This was unacceptable to Washington. On November 8, 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president. Young, untested, he faced mounting pressure to solve the Cuban problem. On April 17, 1961, the US launched the Bay of Pigs invasion. 1,400 CIA-backed Cuban exiles landed on the island's southern coast to overthrow Castro. But the plan collapsed. Within 72 hours, the exiles were defeated, captured, or killed. To protect its image, the United States denied all involvement. Castro, enraged by the US intervention, turned to the Soviet Union for protection. Between 1961 and 1962, the US had deployed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey, placing Moscow just 10 minutes from destruction. When Castro asked for help, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw his chance. He reportedly said, "Let them learn what it feels like to have enemy missiles pointing at you." His decision was bold and secret. Nuclear missiles would be stationed in Cuba. The operation began under the cover of darkness. On September 8, 1962, the first missile shipments docked in Cuban ports. Crates labeled agricultural equipment hid R-12 ballistic missiles, each capable of carrying a 1 megaton warhead. The countdown to crisis had begun. On October 14, 1962, a US U-2 spy plane flew high over western Cuba on routine surveillance. The pilot noticed something odd: rectangular clearings in the jungle. On closer inspection, the high-resolution cameras revealed the truth. Missile sites hidden in Cuban fields with launch pads, fuel tanks, and Soviet reactors. The film was rushed to Washington. President Kennedy was informed that afternoon. He immediately formed XCOM, a secret group of his closest advisors, including his brother Robert, Defense Secretary McNamara, and CIA Director McCone. For 6 days, they met in the White House basement, debating every option: airstrikes, invasion, diplomacy. On October 22, Kennedy made his choice. That evening, he addressed the nation from the Oval Office, revealing the missiles and announcing a naval quarantine of Cuba. After intense debate, XCOM concluded that a blockade was the only way to stop more Soviet weapons from reaching the island without triggering immediate war. Kennedy signed NSAM 196, formally authorizing the quarantine. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev called it outright piracy and clear aggression. He vowed the ships would never turn back. On October 24, 1962, at 10 a.m., the naval quarantine went into effect. A line of US warships stretched across the Atlantic, 500 miles from Cuba. Khrushchev stood firm. Soviet cargo ships, escorted by submarines, continued steaming towards the line. The world watched, breathless, as the two superpowers came face to face. 25 Soviet vessels approached. Then, one by one, they slowed, halted, and turned back. It was a stunning victory for Kennedy. The blockade had worked. In the White House, Secretary of State Dean Rusk said, "We are eyeball to eyeball," and the other guy just blinked. But the crisis was far from over. The same day, US forces were raised to DEFCON 2, the closest America had ever come to nuclear war. Troops poured into Florida. The state transformed into a vast military camp. An invasion seemed inevitable. Then on October 26, a flicker of hope arrived. Khrushchev sent his first letter to Kennedy. He offered a way out. If the United States pledged not to invade Cuba, the missiles would be removed. For the first time, a diplomatic solution seemed possible. But the next day would become the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, the most tense moment of the crisis, a day remembered as the Black Saturday. At 6 a.m., the CIA delivered grim news. Five of the six missile sites in Cuba were now fully operational. At 9 a.m., Fidel Castro sent an urgent cable to Moscow. He believed a US invasion was imminent. He urged Khrushchev to launch the first nuclear strike. At 10 a.m., Khrushchev's second letter arrived in Washington. This one was different, public, and far tougher. He now demanded the removal of US Jupiter missiles from Italy and Turkey. At 11:19 a.m., an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. Major Rudolph Anderson, the pilot, was killed. The crisis had claimed its first casualty. Public pressure on Kennedy surged. The military demanded immediate retaliation. At 9:52 p.m., far out in Sargasso Sea, Soviet submarine B-59 was being hunted by US destroyers enforcing the quarantine. American ships dropped depth charges not to destroy but to force the submarine to surface. Inside B-59, cut off from Moscow, the temperature soared past 45 degrees Celsius. Oxygen was running low. The crew believed war had already begun. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, and the political officer gave the order to arm the nuclear torpedo. One more signature was needed. Vasily Arkhipov, the second in command. But he refused and instead argued for the submarine to be surfaced. Archipov's decision stopped the nuclear strike and quite possibly saved the world from a World War III. That evening, Attorney General Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. A deal was struck. Publicly, the US would pledge not to invade Cuba. Privately, America would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy, but only later and in silence. On October 28, 1962, millions tuned in to Radio Moscow. Khrushchev's voice came through. The Soviet government has given a new order. The weapons in Cuba will be withdrawn. The world exhaled. The quarantine was lifted on November 20 after UN inspectors verified the missile removal. By April 1963, the US quietly dismantled its Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy. The crisis was over. 13 days, the world stood on edge. One wrong move, one miscalculation, one order given too quickly, and everything ends. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing and sharing with friends. Thank you.